Hi, and welcome to this video about ODFW's statewide barrier prioritization. In this video, I'll discuss the importance of prioritizing fish passage barriers, how the department has prioritized barriers in the past, and how we plan to update that list in 2023. I'm Catherine Nordholm, a biologist with ODFW's Fish Passage Program. ODFW has an inventory of over 40,000 potential fish passage barriers around the state. This map shows that inventory, which includes artificial and natural barriers that vary from fully passable to fully blocked. ODFW fish passage rules require that artificial barriers are addressed during certain trigger events, including replacement or major repairs. With more than 40,000 barriers throughout the state, prioritization helps focus efforts to provide passage to the fish passage barriers with the highest impact to fish populations. The statewide barrier prioritization focuses on high-priority artificial obstructions that create barriers to fish passage. This list was last updated in 2019. This map shows the 587 statewide priority barriers on the 2019 priority list. This list is being updated in 2023 with the goal of having a new list published in 2024. The department's fish passage priority list is required by Oregon law. Oregon statute and ODFW fish passage rules highlight the list for enforcement actions based on the needs of native migratory fish. The law and rules also require that the list is reviewed and amended by ODFW to be updated by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission every 5 years. Although the list was originally envisioned for enforcement, it has been an effective tool for directing voluntary fish passage restoration. Recent changes to ODFW's fish passage rules added a focus on restoration to the purpose of the priority list. Additionally, the department added language allowing for the prioritization to account for future habitat quality and quantity metrics to help adjust the prioritization to account for climate change predictions when needed. Ultimately, the statewide barrier prioritization takes barriers of all types and sizes and ranks them based on their impact to native migratory fish. This slide shows examples of some of the barriers that are on the 2019 list. The list includes barriers that range from large dams that impact access to hundreds of miles of habitat to small dams and culverts that may impact much smaller areas for only part of the year. Regardless of size and severity of the barrier, every barrier on the list has an impact to native migratory fish and their ability to access current or historic habitat. Now I'm going to cover the method that ODFW has used to determine which fish passage barriers go on the list and how those barriers are scored. The priority list includes only statewide high priority fish passage barriers. The high priority barriers are identified by ODFW district fish biologists based on local knowledge of barriers, habitat, and fish populations in their districts. Barriers are removed from the list as they get addressed or as new information on the barriers reduces their priority. The barriers on the list are scored with an equation that incorporates habitat metrics and fish species metrics. These include the habitat quality and quantity available upstream of the barrier, the level of passage currently at the barrier, the number of species impacted by the fish passage barrier, and if those species are ESA listed, meaning that they are listed as endangered, threatened, or species of concern. Finally, the equation has a component to add or subtract points for site-specific knowledge that is not captured in the other aspects of the equation. This is the equation used to score the passage barriers in the 2019 priority list. I'll cover each section in detail in the next few slides. The equation used to score and rank fish passage barriers for the 2019 list had three main segments. The first is habitat access, which is how much habitat is available upstream of the barrier. This section has scores for the quantity and quality of habitat available. The habitat quantity and quality score are multiplied by the level of passage, which reduces the score for barriers that do not fully block fish passage. The next section of the equation is the species impacted section. The equation gives points to the barrier score for each species of native migratory fish impacted, and additional points if that species is listed as threatened, endangered, or sensitive. The final section of the equation is the auto up and auto down sections. This section adds or subtracts points for site-specific or regional knowledge of a barrier, fish species, or other issues that add or reduce the priority of the barrier. I'm going to walk through each of these in more detail. The details of this equation and the methods for the 2019 barrier priority list can also be found on the website shown on the screen. Points are assigned for habitat quantity based on the amount of habitat accessible to native migratory fish if passage was provided. Points range from 10 points for less than a mile of habitat to 130 points if there are more than 300 miles of habitat upstream of a barrier. The habitat quality score is a way of measuring the quality of fish habitat upstream of a barrier. There are two components to the habitat quality score. The first is species associations, and the second is habitat quality divisions. The species association component of the habitat quality metric was derived during the 2019 prioritization. This was a multi-step process where different fish abundances were related to mean summer stream temperatures and basement catchment areas using regression trees. This slide shows the species association group for 32 species of native migratory fish. There were 4 categories of species associations developed for barrier prioritization. These species associations represent distinct thermal and physical characteristics of Oregon rivers based on known fish species distributions. For example, the fish species in Species Association 1 were positively related to 5 different habitat quality divisions, including the cold headwater, cool headwater, cold stream, cool stream, and medium river classifications. Similarly, the fish species in Species Association 2 were positively correlated with cool headwaters, warm headwaters, cold streams, cool streams, and medium rivers. And fish species in Association 3 were correlated with cool headwaters, warm headwaters, cold streams, and cool streams. And finally, the fish species in Species Association 4 were correlated with cool streams, medium rivers, and large river segments. So, to calculate the habitat quality score for barrier prioritization, you would first look at the species of fish that would use the habitat upstream from a barrier, and then determine the river segment classifications that were upstream of that barrier. The score for the barrier would get 1 point for each river segment classification that was associated with a fish species association that was present at the site and would use the habitat upstream of the barrier. Here is an example of how a habitat quality score would be calculated for a barrier. The star on the map on the right represents the fish passage barrier. In this example, there are red band trout and bull trout at the site that would use the habitat upstream of the barrier. Those species are in Species Association 1, which was correlated with 5 habitat types: cold headwater, cool headwater, cold stream, cool stream, and medium river. When we look at the habitat upstream of the barrier, we see that this example has 3 of the habitat divisions associated with the species that would use this habitat. So this barrier would get 3 points for its habitat quality score. The next component of the equation used to score a barrier on the priority list is the level of fish passage at the barrier. The level of passage is scored from 0 to 5, with 0 representing a structure where volitional passage is present for all species and all life histories of fish, and a structure with a score of 5 represents a full barrier that no fish could pass. The level of passage is used to modify the habitat quantity and quality score. If a barrier is a full barrier, the score includes the full value for habitat quantity and quality. However, if there is partial passage at the barrier, those scores are reduced. For example, if the level of passage was 1, where the structure was a barrier to some native migratory fish juveniles for only part of their migration period, but otherwise fish could pass the barrier, the habitat quantity and quality score would be multiplied by 1/5, thus reducing the score to just 20% of the score that a full barrier would receive. The second section of the equation are the scores for the species that are impacted at the site. This section allocates points for each species and additional points if the species is listed as endangered, threatened, or as a species of special concern. The equation gives 20 points for each species at the site and additional points for ESA species, with 40 points for every endangered species at the site, 30 points for every threatened species, and 15 points for any species of special concern. The final section of the equation is for auto up and auto down factors that add or remove points to account for additional factors affecting the priority of a barrier. There are 15 points allocated for each auto up factor. These factors could include the presence of unique stocks of fish or fish with a limited distribution, access to rare habitat, or barriers that affect an especially large amount of habitat. Auto down factors subtract points from the total score for a variety of reasons, including the presence of complete barriers downstream of the site, fish management concerns if there were no barrier at the site, upstream barriers that would reduce the uplift of providing passage at the site, or legal agreements between the landowner and ODF&W to block fish passage at the site. Once all the barriers on the priority list are scored and sorted, the list is finalized for publication. For the 2019 list, the barriers were grouped, with each group representing barriers of similar priority rankings. The final list goes to the Fish and Wildlife Commission for review and adoption prior to being published. The final priority list and supporting documents are available on the ODFW Fish Passage website. The ODFW Fish Passage Priority List has been an effective tool for outreach, education, and restoration. The priority list is a simple tool to focus statewide efforts to restore fish passage. The strength of the list is that it is easy to use and to update. The list has helped increase awareness of fish passage barriers and has been very effective at identifying and directing attention to restoring passage at fish passage barriers that have a large impact on native migratory fish. Another benefit of the list is that it is publicly available for anyone to access, download, and use. Since the original list was published, many fish passage barriers have been addressed each year, like this dam, which was on the 2019 list and was removed last year to restore fish passage on Gales Creek in the Tualatin River Basin. However, it is important to be aware of what the ODFW barrier prioritization list intends to do and how it should be used. The priority score of a barrier is only as accurate as the information ODF&W has on that barrier, and data accuracy for all barriers on the list can be challenging. Although the accuracy of the information in the list improves every time the list is updated, there are still errors, and the most common ones are for barriers that miss points for species that are at the site. Additionally, some upstream habitat miles are estimates or based on professional judgment, since survey data is not available for all habitat upstream from the barrier. And finally, the habitat quality score is often difficult to understand and reproduce for many structures on the list. Another weakness of the list is that the equation will score and rank any barrier. The equation alone does not determine if a barrier is a priority. The equation was intended to score and prioritize barriers that had already been identified as being a high priority. The priority list is also not an optimization tool. It ranks barriers based on the needs of native migratory fish and does not include cost estimates or a component that optimizes what order barriers should be addressed in or where you would get the most uplift for the cost of a project. And finally, there's also no indication of how likely a barrier on the list is to get addressed. The priority list doesn't indicate if there are willing landowners, costs, feasibility factors, or other dynamics that would affect the ability to implement a fish passage project at the site. To conclude this video, I want to discuss the upcoming update to the statewide barrier priority list. This update will take place during 2023 and 2024 and will focus on improvements to the list, especially incorporating the climate change factors mentioned at the beginning of this video. ODF&W invites the public to participate in this process. There are multiple ways to participate, beginning with the initial public comment period planned for July. Additional questions or comments can be submitted anytime to the Fish Passage email at fish.passage@odfw.oregon.gov. The barrier prioritization will also be discussed publicly at the upcoming Fish Passage Task Force meetings in October and December. Each meeting will have an open public comment period. Members of the task force will be advising ODFW during the update. There will also be a public comment period as the updated list is reviewed by the Fish and Wildlife Commission next year. You can also find information on the Fish Passage Barrier Inventory's website at the link on the screen. This site has details on the 2019 list and will have information on the effort to update the list throughout the year. Feel free to email the ODFW Fish Passage Program with any questions or comments. Thank you.